Today we're looking at some outright unbelievable, yet completely true stories about one of the most legendary bombers of World War II, the B-17 Flying Fortress. When nearly half of all bomber crewmen became casualties, falling out was just one part of the job description, and horror stories were never in short supply. Let's begin. Before getting into the stories, let's quickly set the stage for how the bombing campaign worked and why it was so dangerous. The B-17 bomber was America's aerial sledgehammer against Nazi Germany. What made it a flying fortress was its armament, bristling with up to 13 50 caliber machine guns in later models, resembling a porcupine with anger issues. The B-17G, considered the definitive variant, had guns in its nose, chin, dorsal, waist, ball turret, and tail positions, creating overlapping fields of fire in all directions. And you may be wondering why they needed so many machine guns and why so horribly many bombers got destroyed regardless. Well, ask the German anti-aircraft defense. While the British RAF preferred bombing under cover of darkness, American commanders believed that their bombers, flying in tight formations with mutually supporting fields of fire, could punch through any German defenses in broad daylight, so they could hit targets with remarkable precision. They were half right, and by that we mean every fourth bomber was lost and every second crew member was killed, while only about 20% of the bombs actually hit their intended targets. Fighter attacks were the main danger, especially early in the war, and that's the reason for all the guns on board. But the introduction of P-51 Mustangs as long-range escorts eventually gave bombers much-needed protection against the Luftwaffe. Flak, however, was unavoidable and impossible to fight back against. The Germans ringed their valuable targets with 88 and 105mm anti-aircraft guns, arranged in batteries of dozens or even hundreds, and they weren't randomly firing into the sky hoping for a lucky hit. They were coordinated by radar and fire control systems that calculated exactly where the bombers would be. When a B-17 formation approached a target, the sky ahead would suddenly erupt with black puffs of smoke. A direct hit would obliterate an aircraft instantly, while near misses sent shrapnel tearing through aluminum skin, control cables, fuel tanks, and of course, crew. Protocol demanded that bombers fly in tight formation, no evasive action, no deviation. The bombardier needed a steady platform to drop their payload accurately. In these moments, there was nothing to do but sit, fly straight, and hope for the best. You'd see a nearby bomber get hit, start smoking, then just start going down. You'd hope that you'd at least see parachutes opening below, but most often there weren't any. After dropping bombs, they would break formation and start their way back to base, which many never reached. However, the B-17 could take a frightening amount of punishment and survive, proving its nickname. Sights of bombers limping home with entire sections blown away, engines on fire, or giant holes torn through fuselages became common. So with that in mind, let's start with the story of a B-17 that came back in two pieces, literally. On February 1st, 1943, a formation of B-17s took off from Biskra, Algeria, bound for German-occupied seaports in Tunisia. Among them was a B-17 nicknamed All-American. After successfully dropping their payload, the formation turned back for the 300-mile return journey. That's when two German Messerschmitt fighters decided to crash the party with a head-on attack. The B-17 gunners responded with their machine guns, sending the first German fighter down in flames. The second Messerschmitt started to break away, but its pilot was hit and lost control of his aircraft. What happened next defies physics, engineering, and common sense. The German fighter narrowly missed the waist gunner, and its wings sliced through the All-American's tail section, nearly severing it completely from the fuselage. The tail gunner found himself trapped in what was essentially now a separate aircraft, connected by only a few strands of aluminum on the right side and bits of the floor. From another B-17, Lieutenant Charles Cutforth snapped what would become one of the most jaw-dropping photographs of the air war, a flying fortress with its tail hanging by a thread, somehow still airborne. Two engines out, left horizontal stabilizer gone, left elevator missing, rudder and vertical fin mangled, nearly every control wire to the tail section severed. In aviation terms, this is what they call completely screwed. But by nothing short of a miracle, the autopilot happened to be engaged during the collision using electrical wiring and servo motors instead of mechanical cables. The pilots used these remaining controls to keep the bomber stable while the tail twisted and swayed. The rest of the formation slowed down to protect their wounded comrade, watching in disbelief as the All-American somehow stayed airborne. Against all odds, the All-American not only made it back, but managed a safe landing with no serious injuries to the crew. It was even repaired and continued flying missions until the war's end. Speaking of seemingly impossible survival stories, how about falling out without a parachute, and in more than one crazy isolated case? January 3rd, 1943, the skies over Saint-Nazaire, France. Alan Maggi was crammed into the ball turret of his B-17F, nicknamed Snap, Crackle, Pop, as part of a massive bombing raid on the German U-boat pens. Just 20 years old, Maggi had already flown 6 missions, but number 7 would be something different. As the formation approached the target, the sky erupted with flak. A sudden explosion rocked the B-17, knocking out an engine. Then a direct hit shattered the bomber's right wing. With the aircraft fatally wounded and spiraling out of control, Maggi tried to get back inside the fuselage from his ball turret position. As the ball turret was barely 4 feet wide, the gunner's parachute couldn't fit inside with him, so it had to be stored in the fuselage. If something went wrong, he'd need to rotate the turret to align with the aircraft, open the hatch, climb inside, grab his parachute, strap it on, and then bail out, all while the bomber was potentially on fire or breaking apart, as was the case here. He managed to get inside, but what he found was a nightmare. His parachute had been shredded by a flak hit. As the doomed B-17 began breaking apart at 20,000 feet, another explosion tore through the bomber. The force blasted Maggi right out of the aircraft, without a parachute. Free falling from 4 miles up, Maggi lost consciousness due to lack of oxygen and the extremely low temperatures. This was certain death. But by some impossible twist of fate, his unconscious body crashed through the glass roof of the Saint-Nazaire train station. The angled glass panels slowed his descent just enough before he landed on the floor of the station. German soldiers found him barely alive. His right arm and leg were broken, his nose and eye injured, and he had 28 shrapnel wounds. The Germans were so stunned to find him alive that they immediately got him medical attention. After treatment, Maggi spent 18 months as a prisoner of war before being liberated in 1945. After the war, Maggi would live to the age of 84, carrying the scars and memories of that impossible day. But Maggi wasn't the only one to fall out of a bomber. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran manned the tailgun position of a B-17 with the peculiar name Ricky Tiki Tavi during a bombing run over Bremen, Germany in November 1943. It was supposed to be a standard mission, if standard means flying through storms of flak and fighter attacks over one of the most heavily defended cities in the Reich. The mission went sideways fast. Who would expect that? Luftwaffe fighters swarmed the formation, and Moran's bomber took heavy hits. Moran was shot in both his arms, and an explosion broke his ribs. As if that wasn't enough, he discovered that his parachute had been shot to ribbons as well, rendering it useless if he needed to bail out, and he would need just that in a moment. As he desperately searched for another chute, a catastrophic hit severed the entire tail section of the B-17 clean off the fuselage. In an instant, Moran found himself in a detached tail, spinning through the sky at 20,000 feet. Tumbling at around 100 feet per second, Moran made a decision that likely saved his life. He stopped fighting. Accepting what seemed like certain death, he simply relaxed, at least as much as he could, and waited for the inevitable impact. But fate had other plans. The separated tail section crashed into a tall pine tree during its descent, slowing the impact just enough to prevent immediate death when it finally hit the ground. German soldiers who witnessed the crash were stunned to find Moran still alive in the wreckage, but his survival was only the beginning of his ordeal. With a crushed skull and severe wounds, Moran's life hung by a thread. A Serbian doctor who was also a prisoner of war treated Moran's devastating wounds, somehow keeping him alive with minimal medical supplies. For the next 18 months, Moran endured the brutal conditions of German POW camps, and against all odds, survived until liberation. In January 1944, James Rayleigh, another tail gunner in a B-17 named Skippy, experienced a similar fate. During a mission near Athens, his bomber collided with another B-17 in cloud cover. Like Moran, Rayleigh found himself spinning toward the ground inside a detached tail section, even unaware that he was separated from the rest of the aircraft, thinking they were all falling together. He too survived when the tail hit trees, breaking his fall. After a couple of minutes of free fall that to him seemed like an eternity, he climbed out of the tail and was shocked to realize that the rest of the bomber was actually not there and that he was alone. He was later rescued by Greek Orthodox monks. For those who weren't ejected without their choice, a bailout was their only hope, but even this was a dangerous proposition. Crewmen had to navigate narrow escape hatches while wearing bulky flight gear, often while their aircraft was in an uncontrolled spin. Many were knocked unconscious or injured during the exit itself. Of those shot down, only about 25% managed to successfully bail out and deploy their parachutes. If you think surviving a fall from 20,000 feet without a parachute or flying without a tail was the pinnacle of bomber crew miracles, think again. When flak found the lovely Julie over Cologne on October 15, 1944, it was a catastrophic direct hit that tore its face off, meaning a sure end for everyone on board. But that's somehow not what happened. First Lieutenant Lawrence Delancey had just watched his bombardier release their payload when the world in front of him exploded, as a flak shell detonated directly in the nose compartment. The blast killed Staff Sergeant George Abbott instantly, his body absorbing most of the shrapnel that would have otherwise shredded everyone in the cockpit. The entire nose section of the B-17 disintegrated. The plexiglass, aluminum skin, and internal structure vanished, leaving nothing but a gaping hole where the front of the bomber should be. Delancey found himself sitting in what was essentially an open convertible at 20,000 feet, with -40-degree winds hitting them at 200 miles per hour. The instrument panel was shredded, no airspeed indicator, no altimeter, no compass. The oxygen system was out as well, meaning the crew would suffocate within minutes at that altitude. Assessing the impossible situation, thinking to himself how they were even flying or alive at all after a direct hit, Delancey made the only desperate move that could possibly save them. He dove to a lower altitude where they could breathe, but where they were an easy target for every German gun between Cologne and the English Channel. Navigator Raymond Ledoux, who'd lost all his maps and equipment in the blast, had to guide them home through enemy territory. The freezing wind tore at their faces as they fought to keep the dying bomber level. The other crew members, certain they were living their final moments, braced for the inevitable crash. But Delancey wasn't done. Despite missing half the aircraft's nose, they limped across enemy territory, somehow crossed the channel and made it back to Nuthampstead, England. With no functioning brakes or flaps, only Delancey knows how he landed the mangled bomber successfully, earning him a Silver Star. If you want to find out more about the B-17 and the job their crews had, you can watch this video here.